having me today. So, excuse me, a little frog in my throat. I'm going to be speaking about pediatric medical devices, so a little bit different than some of the clinical topics we've had so far today. Pediatric medical devices are about 10 years behind adult medical devices. And just to put this in perspective for everyone, this is the TV that we all had in 2005, and this is what you guys have in your living rooms today. So that, I think, just tells you a little bit about the technology difference that we're seeing between what type of adult devices are out there for adults and what's out there for pediatric devices. So I wanted to give this example of the ventricular assist device. There's an adult ventricular assist device, and then many of you may have seen the pediatric version of this, the Berlin Heart. So this is the Berlin Heart device. As you can see, this is a giant machine that sits, this is the bedside of a child in our ICU, actually. Just to put this in perspective, this is a crib here. This is a device that the child is attached to the entire time that they're waiting for a heart transplant. This is a heart transplant destination device only, approved by the FDA about 2 years ago. And the child's attached to this the whole time, so when they do recover from their ventricular assist device surgery and they're able to be mobile in our unit, they actually have to be followed along by someone who's pushing this device. So that's in contrast to here. This is what the adults have who have heart failure. This is the adult ventricular assist device here, the little console. This person can be out in the world waiting for heart transplant or even recovering from their heart condition. This can also be used as a destination device, meaning if there is a heart condition that that adult can't recover from, they can actually live for years and years with this device. They can go to work, they can exercise, they're out of the hospital, and those are all options that we don't have in pediatrics. So I think it's a good example of what I mean by that 10-year lag. Just to go into this a little bit further, these are the cannulas that go into our babies who get Berlin ventricular assist devices. As you can see, they're large. They're actually quite painful. They cause skin irritation and they cause infection. And this is the adult version. So one small little drive line entering into the abdomen. It's pretty comfortable. Like I said, people can go out, be mobile, they can exercise, they can go to work with this, and it's fairly well hidden, this little backpack that contains the batteries. So this is a huge difference between what our pediatric patients get for their heart failure treatment and what the adult patients get. And this is one of the main reasons that I work in pediatric devices. I want to help close that gap. So why is there a 10-year lag? There's 4 main reasons: funding, testing, FDA regulation, and then the patient themselves. The first 3 actually mostly have to do with the size of the market. If you think about how big the pediatric market is compared to the adult market, you can imagine that it's quite a bit smaller, and that tends to affect every part of the device development phase. So just to at first give you a little bit of an idea of what it takes to develop a medical device, it's actually a lot more complicated than developing something like an iPod. The people at Apple had it very simple compared to the people at Medtronic or Boston Scientific. The first stages here are somewhat similar in that you create a product, you engineer around it, you submit a patent to protect your intellectual property, you do some prototyping, maybe you go back to the ideation and the engineering. Then you do some bench proof of concept. So if it's something like a valve, you stick it in a flow circuit. If it's a tape measure, you try it out on some kids. But there has to be some sort of proof of concept. And then as a medical device, you really need, for most complex medical devices, we'll have to go through an animal proof of concept. So for instance, that valve that you're building, before it can ever think about seeing a human being, has to go in some animals first. Those are short-term studies and also long-term studies where you put the device in an animal and then they run around the farm for a few months to make sure that that device is going to be safe and does what you say it's going to do. But that's where things completely diverge from a device outside of the medical world. For a medical device, we talk about first in man and clinical trials. Those things, particularly for invasive or very new devices, have to be approved by the FDA before you can think about doing those things. You also need to get an IRB submission in. So these are all things that the people at Apple didn't have to worry about. Clinical trials, as you guys all know, especially for a device, can take 5 to 10 years. Some clinical trials are millions and millions of dollars and require multiple sites. So for instance, the new pumpkin trials, which you may have heard of, that are looking at a new ventricular assist device for kids, are looking at 22 sites. So you can imagine the cost and the manpower and the time that it takes to get a 22-site randomized control trial going. The FDA is also very concerned about manufacturing plans. They want to know what materials you're using, that you have quality systems in place, that there's going to be safe sterilization, that the people who are putting together your new valve are educated and have a safety system in place. And then the FDA submission itself, which takes about 2 years to get through, depending on the type of device. And then finally, after that, even if you get through the FDA, you still have to worry about, how am I going to get reimbursed for this? Is there a code in place? Do I have a marketing team? Am I going to be able to reach the doctors and nurses and providers who are putting these devices in? And then post-market follow-up, another piece of the FDA puzzle where we look and see, okay, how has this device been doing safety-wise and efficacy-wise for those first couple years out? So it's a pretty complex plan, even for the adult market, which is sizably larger. So the first piece and the first challenge that we face in pediatric medical device is really the funding. And again, going back to a small market. So in Minneapolis, where I work, we have quite a bit of medical device industry there, and we have some venture capital. So one group that we work with called Split Rock, these are their criteria. And you can imagine how this works for pediatrics. The first thing they want is significant market size. And what they call significant market size is over $500 million market. The second thing they want is a rapid development timeline and commercialization potential in less than 5 years. So those are very difficult things for any device, but particularly smaller market device, as you find in pediatrics. So just to give you an idea of the kind of numbers that we're talking about in peds, the adult global heart valve market is $1.2 billion, so well over that $500 million venture capital cutoff. So these guys, when they start up a company, they have access to that venture capital funding, because this is the stuff that venture capital knows is worth the risk. It's a big market. They're going to make some money on the end of that development process. The peds heart valve market, much smaller, $50 to $100 million. Now, we're fortunate to have a few big companies that actually believe that pediatrics is important to invest in. So we have actually had a couple valves come out, and that speaks to the fact that you can actually overcome some of these challenges. But the market size is much smaller, even for a fairly robust market like peds valves. So smaller testing, another challenge that we have is the smaller test population. And this is, we all know that the under 15 market is much, much smaller than the over 15 market. And not only that, but our kids in general tend to be a lot healthier than adults. So the market is not only smaller by numbers, but just smaller by pathology. The third piece of this testing, and this gets into regulation a little bit, is that it is much more difficult to convince a family to randomize their child into a study than it is to convince a patient themselves. And I'm sure you guys have all experienced this. Of course, parents are much more aware of the consequences of their choosing to randomize their child into a trial. So that is something that, that is another challenge to doing testing for devices. And then finally, regulation, FDA regulation. Of course, everything has to be approved through the FDA, but the very simplest of devices, traditionally more stringent for pediatrics. But also, again, testing is just more difficult in the pediatric population. You need those large multi-site clinical trials in order to get enough numbers. As example, the pumpkin example I gave earlier, where they needed 22 sites to get that many patients. And then, again, difficult to do those randomized consents with your families that just want to absolutely do the right thing for their kids. So this is the traditional device pathway. A new device that requires pre-market approval will take on average $100 million at this point and 10 years to get through the US market. So that's an adult device, not adding in the challenges that we face in pediatrics. And that's from going from about a year of concept and design, a couple years for preclinical engineering development. The clinical trials are probably the most expensive piece of this with the FDA review, and these two things happen at once. If you're a device that's less complex, which we call a 510K, so a device that has a similar device already out on the market, or something that's considered not high risk to the patient, that's only about 9 months, and that's pretty doable even in pediatrics. But when we talk about class 3 or pre-market approval devices, you're talking 3 years to get through those clinical trials at the bare minimum. The FDA review, and then one thing that is frequently forgotten about until the last minute is those reimbursement codes. So even if you have an FDA-approved device, if you can't get paid for it, if you can't get reimbursed for it, then that's a no-go. And then finally, we all know this as pediatricians, but children are not small adults. They have things about them that make it a little bit more challenging to build devices around them. I think the biggest one is age and size variation. So it's hard to build a device for a 2-year-old that also works in a 15-year-old and vice versa. Just in terms of those sizes are much different, and sometimes sizing something differently can change the physical properties of the device. The second most important thing is growth. Children grow, especially very rapidly in those first couple years, and that's something that we've really been faced with as a challenge in cardiology. I also work in the cardiac ICU, and those valves don't grow with the patient right now, although there are people who are working on that. So those kids are getting surgeries every 2 or 3 years sometimes as they grow out of their hardware in their heart. Immune variation, as you know, neonates have a much different immune system than our 2-year-olds that have a different immune system than our 6-year-olds. They're faced with different types of viruses, different bacteria are more or less susceptible in those age populations. And so that can be a little bit of a barrier, especially when you're talking about devices that are coated with things. That's also true of their coagulation system, which I'm sure our hematologists would have seen the difficulties of designing devices for different ages that clot differently as well. And then finally, one important thing about kids is that they're dependent on caretakers. So you have to build devices with who is taking care of them in mind as well. So going back to that Berlin heart, one reason we can't send them home with that is because they don't have trained caretakers at home that are able to deal with a machine as complex as the Berlin heart. So those are our 4 biggest challenges: the funding, the testing, the regulation, and then the pediatric patient in general. So really the traditional method of making and selling medical devices just doesn't work for most pediatric populations. So how do pediatric devices get to market? So addressing the funding challenge. In the past 5 to 10 years, the FDA has generously contributed millions of dollars to new FDA-funded pediatric device consortia. There are also several groups, including ours, which is the Pediatric Device Innovation Consortium at the University of Minnesota, that are funded through the CTSI or other organizations within the university. And the idea behind those consortium are, let's take university resources with industry knowledge on how to develop devices and put those 2 things together. That way we can work with private inventors, we can work with inventors at the university, we can work with big companies, and we can help move devices along a little bit easier. The basic premise of many consortiums, including ours, is if you can take a device and build it at the university and take it as far along as possible with industry assistance, then you can de-risk that device and make it a little bit more palatable for industry once they're ready to take it out. So rather than asking them to take on all the risk of all the stages, we ask the university with their NIH grants and other access to funds and resources to take it as far along as possible, and then the industry helps us handle some of the later stage development. So all of the consortium, and I'll give you a list at the end of this, will provide both financial and non-financial support to inventors. So if any of you have ideas or things that you're working on, these are great resources, especially for early stage funding if you want to build a prototype, if you want to get some intellectual property, if you need to do some animal testing even. These are groups that are actively looking for projects and want to help inventors. So I'll just mention briefly the PDIC at the University of Minnesota. This is our website. We provide a yearly grant program to any group with a University of Minnesota investigator. That being said, many of the groups that get funding from us are not from the university. They just work with the university collaborator, and we don't actually maintain any of the intellectual property. We're also launching a website right now for the general public to submit their personal medical challenges. So for instance, the parents out there who have frustrating situations at home with chronic kids, who are dealing with all the problems of using ventilators and trachs and IV poles and everything at home or in our hospitals. We want to hear about those challenges, and we feel like we're missing out on the voice of the parent. So we're setting up this website, which actually will be out next week, so that we can collect some of those challenges and then provide funding for some of the best and most high impact needs that we're seeing through that. We also host an annual inventor industry event specifically for pediatrics to foster collaboration between inventors in pediatrics and our industry in town. And that is held at the Design of Medical Devices Conference every year. And then, honestly, we will meet any inventor with a pediatric device or even a pediatric device idea who wants to sit down with us and understand the device development process a little bit better. So other sources of funding, when a pediatric inventor comes to me and says, I just can't find any funding, my project is too small for venture capital, these are the places that I point them. The first is the STTR program, which is a Small Business Innovation Research Program through the government. They offer many different RFAs for devices, many of which actually are applicable to pediatrics. And this is a great place to start a project out. And in order to qualify this, you need to have a person who is more than 50% of time free to be the principal investigator, but you can have the university involved, you can have companies involved. It's pretty flexible in terms of the other collaborators. So it's great for small businesses that want to work on pediatric devices with a university or with another company. And we have several of these that we work on with outside companies as well. It's a good way for companies to be able to participate in pediatric medical device development without the risk of owning that project. Crowdsourcing, especially for non-invasive devices, has been very successful in pediatrics. So Fitbit-like devices, pediatric home health devices, things that are regulated at the lowest level of the FDA have very successfully been crowdsourced at all of the major websites for crowdsourcing. University Clinical Translational Science Institutes, so your CTSIs, many of the bigger universities have CTSIs available, and most of them will have a translational group that is looking for medical device projects. And I'll tell you a secret, and that is that for the last round of CTSIs, most of them did not have enough pediatric projects, so they're all getting dinged on that. They'll be very excited if you come to them with a pediatric project. Student engineering projects, so our university and many other universities have senior design classes, so you can work with the fourth year undergrad and sometimes graduate level students in engineering who are all excited to work on pediatric projects. We sponsor several of these a year and have actually disclosed and patented several of their projects. And then angel investors who tend to be have a little bit lower level of stringency for what they're looking in projects. Usually this is the $500,000 to $2 million level of funding, and it's great for new companies that have a product that is going to be profitable but isn't necessarily going to be a big home run like some of those adult valve type projects. And then finally, foundation support, so the American Heart Association, the neurological associations, all of those groups are looking to fund specific medical devices that will help the kids that they support, so I encourage you to look there as well. So the regulation challenge. You may have heard of the humanitarian use device designation. This is something that several pediatric products have now used to their advantage to get through the FDA. In fact, the Berlin Heart went through the HUD device designation system at the FDA rather than going through the adult version, the pre-market approval, PMA. And in doing so was able to be a little bit more efficient with their FDA application. So in order to qualify with the FDA as a humanitarian use device, you need to have less than 4,000 patients per year. You do not need to prove efficacy, which is one of the biggest reasons to do it. If you can imagine trying to prove efficacy for some of these very small market devices, that's very difficult. You do, however, need to prove safety. And profit is allowed if it's a pediatric device. So the HUD designation, if you're going to go through the FDA and it's going to be a fairly invasive device, this is one way that many pediatric inventors actually manage to get through the FDA, costing a lot less with a lot less time. So this is an example of one company that used humanitarian use. You may have seen the Melody valve, which was started by a startup company but is now owned by Medtronic. It's a transcatheter valve for congenital heart disease. It was actually the first of its kind, something that many hospitals are using for right-sided valves for their kids who previously required multiple sternotomies for those right-sided heart defects. As they grew, those valves weren't keeping up with them, and so now with the Melody valve, at least rather than doing a sternotomy, we can place this valve via a catheter, which is a lot less invasive. So finally, I just wanted to sum up by saying that even though there are a lot of challenges to the pediatric inventor, I feel like, especially in the last 5 years, we've come up with a lot of great solutions to those challenges, and more, both big companies, small companies, and inventors at universities are finding ways to get these medical devices out. But it requires a lot of help, and so these are the places that you should look if you're looking for help. If you've got an idea or a device, or someone at your university has an idea or device, please send them to one of these places. Like I said, most of these places have active funding available for pediatric inventors, and all of us are willing and very anxious to help the pediatric inventors out there working on specific pediatric technology. So thank you all for your time. Are there any questions? Okay, great.
I have one question for you. With your heart valves, what is the usage for the inhaled vasodilators when they go on the LVADs or things like that? We
use nitric oxide and Flolan both for children who go on both the Berlin and also for the older adolescents who can qualify for the older VAD. So that's something that we use quite a bit.
And so that's basically to treat right heart dysfunction, or? Yes,
especially not just going on the Berlin heart and the HeartMate and the other adult devices, but also post-transplant. They frequently have right heart failure. One thing that is a major problem for both adults and pediatrics is even though you can support the left side of the heart with this ventricular assist device, the right side of the heart may or may not kind of just glump along while you're waiting for a heart. And we found that many kids actually fail even though they have an LVAD in place. We've had to put a BiVAD in place or sometimes keep them sedated and intubated. We have not had great outcomes from those BiVADs, and so that's still something that we're working on. Even though we are supporting both sides of the heart, it's not a natural physiology, and for whatever reason, the heart does not like to have that type of mechanical support on both sides. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.